Beginning in 2019 and continuing in 2020, Global Comics scholars have visited the Ohio State campus, first in person and now virtually, and continuing in 2020, we're talking about global transnational issues from distinct area studies, regional perspectives. Our topics have included global comics scholarship on identity and culture, disability in post-Soviet Russian comics, immigration, and more. We are very grateful to sponsors, the Ohio State University's Center for Latin American Studies, Center for Slavic and East European Studies, and East Asian Studies Centers, with funds from the U.S. Department of Education Title VI grants, and to the Ohio State University libraries. I have a few housekeeping items to share. Audio and video are muted for all attendees. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box and use the chat for general comments and discussion. As you probably have already seen, today's session is being recorded for future viewing. And now I would like to introduce Professor Magda El-Sherbini, Middle East Studies Librarian for the Ohio State University Libraries. Magda?
Thank you, Nina, and thank you all for attending this webinar. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ganzir. Described as a chameleon in the New York Times, Ganzir operates seamlessly between art, design, and storytelling, creating what he has coined concept pop. His medium of choice, as described by Kaylin Wilson Goldie on artform.com, is a little bit of everything: stencils, murals, paintings, pamphlets, comics, installations, and graphic design. With over 40 exhibitions to his name, Ganzir's work has been seen in a wide variety of art galleries, impromptu spaces, alleyways, and major museums around the world, such as the Brooklyn Museum in New York, the Palace of the Arts in Cairo, Greek State Museum in Thessaloniki, the V&A in London, and the Edith Roth House in Oldenburg. He has been an artist in residence in Germany, Poland, Jordan, Holland, and Finland, and has lived extensively in Cairo, New York, Los Angeles, Denver, and finally Houston, where he is now based. Current projects include a collection of sci-fi shorts titled Time's New Human, as well as an ambitious graphic novel titled The Solar Grid, which has earned him a Global Thinker Award from Foreign Policy. More about Ganzir can be found at ganzir.com. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest presenter, Ganzir. Ganzir?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Magda, for the lovely introduction. Thank you, Nina, as well. And thank you, everyone, for making the time to show up today. Hopefully the voice is good and everything is operational. So of course, this is a global comics lecture. And of course, comics should and will be the main focus of the presentation. But however, the title of this talk is also from Tahrir to the Solar Grid. Actually, wait, I made a boo-boo. Let me just share the screen again. There we go. Okay. So the title of the talk is From Tahrir to the Solar Grid. And so I'll be selecting some key works from my past, a lot of artivism that sort of like paints a bit of the picture and trajectory of what led me to finally get to work on the Solar Grid. The Solar Grid being a rather ambitious science fiction graphic novel that I've been working on for the past 5 years now and counting. I'm sure there might be a number of you who are not entirely aware of what the word tahrir is reference to at all, given that it only kind of came to global prominence 10 years ago with the Egyptian uprising / revolution, depending on how you want to look at it. And maybe some of you attending right now are 20 years old or 21 or something, and 10 years ago you would have been like 10 years old, and maybe what was happening on the news cycle at the time might have escaped you. So Tahrir is a square, a public square in Cairo that became kind of a center point for the Egyptian uprising 10 years ago, where I was fortunate enough to be at the time. So this is Tahrir Square on January 25th of 2011, where which was kind of the first day, is considered the first day of the Egyptian uprising. And you see, basically that's me kind of climbing on a billboard. This billboard in the middle of the square, a lot of people even people who talk about and study the revolution in detail kind of forget that in the middle of Tahrir Square, there was a billboard that was sort of advertised the political party that was that Mubarak, the ex-president dictator at the time, was part of and leader of. So basically I just climbed the back of the billboard and I painted. I didn't go to the square with the intention of painting anything necessarily, but I just so happened to have some spray paint in my backpack. And I also wasn't really planning on protesting, actually. I was sort of just there. Anyway, that's besides the point. So I climbed the billboard and I just spray painted what people were chanting. And they were chanting, down with Mubarak. And so, and you see kind of, I guess people in the square kind of erupting in applause, and that kind of got me thinking a little bit about, the fact that I wasn't, it's not like a very well done, it's just like haphazardly spray painted text, but kind of this idea of even if people are saying it, and chanting it, and the chants were like echoing all across buildings in downtown Cairo. There is kind of the power of I guess the visual of being able to see it represented in front of you, this elephant in the room that has not been presented visually before, right? That everyone knows about, but it's just not being visually represented, and that there's kind of a power to that. But also on that day, there were so many of us who had never been in a protest like this before, where you have hundreds of riot police guys kind of surrounding you, and we had never felt the sensation of tear gas before or any of that. This was kind of a first time for many people, for many things, and so we didn't know how to operate in this sort of situation. We're just sort of figuring it out as we go, and we ended up kind of riot police ended up striking kind of down pretty hard, and a lot of people were hurt. A lot of people were arrested that day. I was lucky to not have had to deal with that. I was able to kind of get out and get back home safely. But I just started to think about it would be nice for there to be some kind of manual of some sort to for people to, if you need like some kind of strategizing and dealing with this sort of police tactics, especially in kind of these situations of mass protests, how to deal with all that stuff, what to use to counteract tear gas. So are there certain clothes maybe that are better to be worn in that situation rather than, because like a lot of us, like I said, I think a lot of people that day weren't planning on protesting. It really was very spontaneous, for myself included. And so I put together a protest manual, basically. And it was largely based on observation, what I saw happen that day, as well as some kind of information that I saw traded on the internet in regards to some of this stuff. But the vast majority of it was kind of specific to the Egyptian situation, based on what I saw that day. And I put this very haphazard kind of, very quickly put together this kind of like a zine, essentially, that kind of dealt with all this stuff, and just kind of sent it off online through email, like and to people I know, telling them, because we knew at that point in time that the social media was probably being monitored very heavily, because there were reports of people who were talking about getting protests, about going out to a protest, getting like arrested early in the morning at cafes and that sort of thing. So there was word of basically social media being monitored, and so I distributed it through just email to people and asked them if they feel like they want to send it off to their people, just make sure to delete where it came from. So basically to eliminate any source, and it was not signed, it was not credited. Basically I didn't think it would actually, I thought, if it did manage to like reach enough people that there's kind of somehow like this sort of organic kind of mass knowledge that we all kind of know that this is what we're supposed to do, and kind of be able to deal with the situation spontaneously in that way, that would be cool. But also I was realistic and like knowing that it probably won't reach as much people to like actually have much of an influence. But much to my surprise, a couple of days later, it did appear in one of the biggest newspapers in the country, which is a state affiliated newspaper, and they had this big multiple page feature on it, kind of with the title that this was the title was the biggest Iranian plot to destroy Egypt. So they credited this to some kind of Iranian plot, probably, and like citing, it was really kind of ridiculous and funny, citing a lot of spelling mistakes in the zine, basically because Iran, the language spoken in Iran is not Arabic, it's Farsi, but the alphabet is similar. The script is similar, kind of like English and French, right? Two different languages, very similar alphabet. So they credited these spelling mistakes in the zine to it probably being an Iranian plot. And it was just because I just put it together in a hurry, like 24 hours. And then the zine later made it to kind of on the Atlantic, and they had translated an excerpt from it to English. And then much later, several months later, when protests broke out in Ukraine, the zine, a translated version in Ukrainian surfaced in Ukraine. And funnily enough, the kind of Russian affiliated television channels, multiple television channels, kind of held up, like showed the fact that there was a version of the zine, of this pamphlet in Arabic, and a version in, that there was a version in Ukrainian as well as in Arabic, was kind of evidence, according to them, that this was a CIA plot to disrupt governments in the Middle East and Ukraine and all this stuff. And, you know, it was just like some punk ass kid, that's being me, in Cairo, who put this together just as a manual for people to deal with state violence, really. Anyway, so back to Egypt. Protests broke out January 25th. A couple weeks later, let's like fast forward a little bit, Mubarak falls, was removed from government. And at that point in time, I suppose, you know, there was, we were all quite aware that there were people who were killed in the process of those 2 weeks, especially on the first few days. And so I guess there was somehow, you deal with a little bit of survivor's guilt a little bit, where like, oh man, like, you know, those people didn't make it, but like we made it, and how is that fair, I guess, or whatever. And that kind of prompted, you know, what was called the, what was labeled the Martyr Murals Project, essentially paintings of people who had been killed in the process of those initial 2 weeks of the revolution. And these were really kind of my first murals. I hadn't done murals before that. I'd done like maybe little stencils and just doing the murals was the matter of scaling up, you know. They all end up, because they're like kind of multiple layered stencils, so you end up having kind of a look that looks a little bit almost like screen prints on walls or something, with the registration a little bit off. And these were done, you know, I would put a call out on like social media, primarily Twitter at the time. Twitter was a different was a different beast 10 years ago. And you know, I got a lot of people responding back, volunteering to help out. At the time, you know, government and government agencies and political interests weren't really part of Twitter at the time, and you know, and you could sort of do that sort of thing without having to worry about it too much. Another project, and this one kind of became quite, I would say, one of the more iconic pieces that came out of the Egyptian Revolution in general, and is kind of very much a visual that is associated with it, primarily because I think it really kind of sums it up, right? At the time, you know, when Mubarak was removed, he was removed by the military, you know, and replaced by there was a military council that was sort of in charge for like what was called the transitional period from dictatorship to democracy and so on. So in the public consciousness, the military was seen as on the revolution side, as opposed to just another state arm, you know. And I would say that this is one of the first pieces that actively criticizes the military, because to people who paid particularly close attention, you could see that the military was not actually on the revolution side at all, as is evident now. You know, if you look at the situation in hindsight, it's like so clear. But at the time, you know, a lot of people, I guess, were fooled by the military's position a little bit. And in this one, you see kind of basically a military tank, so an obvious symbol of, you know, militarism, facing off with a man on a bicycle carrying a tray on his head. This is probably a visual that may not make sense to people who have not been to Cairo, but it's a common sight. You see, basically, this is what is kind of what we call the bread delivery guy, and you'll see it on early mornings in Cairo. Wherever you are in Cairo, there's always going to be like bread delivery guys with trays of bread on their head, and they often, what they do is they deliver fresh bread from the bakeries to retailers or to little eateries, like breakfast eateries that won't need the fresh bread for their breakfast and stuff. And the word for bread in Egyptian Arabic, particularly in Egypt, it's the same word for life. It's used interchangeably. So this symbol, this mural became kind of just a very good metaphor for how the military was at odds with the livelihood of the everyday Egyptian, so to speak. Another reason it became, I guess, a pretty important kind of piece is that the wall itself became a bit of a battleground, in that other artists or non-artists, other folks would come and make their additions to it that had to do with current events at the time. Here, right, this one, I think you guys could see my cursor. So top right, basically, you see like someone added the tank running over all these protesters with all this blood and stuff. This was after what is known as the Maspero incident, which is when a number of Egyptian Christians were protesting at Maspero, is the kind of Egyptian state television building. Were protesting the destruction of a church. I think in another city, the mayor said that the church's construction was illegal or something, and they tore it down. And they were protesting that, and then military showed up to quell the protest, and there were actual military vehicles that ran over protests, and then it erupted into terrible violence. So this was one artist's reaction to that. And then later, we see kind of the more, let's say, fascist / nationalistic kind of vein came and like eliminated all of the protesters who were being run over, and they just put a bunch of Egyptian flags in these protesters' hands, and they just had spray painted "Egypt is for Egyptians." I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, or if the Christian protesters got run over are not Egyptian or something, which doesn't make any sense. But anyway, and then later these were added. Like basically big at the time, General Tantoy, who was the head of the military, was kind of seen as the figure in charge. So you see him eating protesters and stuff, and then later Beheya Shihab came and added like a bunch of. This was in reaction to, it's very small, you can't really see it, but there was an incident known as where there very famous picture in one of the protests where military police were quelling another protest, and there was a very popular image of them dragging a woman, and her clothes were coming off of her body, and then what was revealed was this blue bra that she was wearing, and so in a way the blue bra itself, just the image of the blue bra, became almost a symbol of resistance in and of itself. And so we have here Beheya Shihab. She spray painted these blue bra stencils, as well as the word "no" in different forms. So that was kind of this mural was kind of really the first, I guess, imagery that kind of openly criticized the Egyptian military. The second one, which got me into a little bit of trouble, is this one, which relates closely, I guess, to the kind of head imagery for the title that I created for the title of this talk that I made. And basically, this one again became another quite iconic image, and it's quite associated with that kind of that first with the Egyptian Revolution in general, but more particularly that first kind of wave of criticizing the military. And basically what it says, I'll translate it for you guys. It says, this was just a sticker that I was putting up around town. It says at the top, new, and down here, the Mask of Freedom. From the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to the Sons of the Loving Nation, now available for an unlimited period of time. So for a little bit of context, basically at the time, there was a lot of propaganda on television about, Egypt's transition from dictatorship to democracy. And this was all over television, all over the newspapers, everywhere. And, a lot of people were buying that, but to understand, the state television was largely controlled. There was, they installed the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which was in charge. They installed a military general to kind of overlook all the television stuff. And so you could see there, it was almost like this coordinated, like telling people, okay, everything is good now. Now we're transitioning to democracy. Everybody could chill out and calm down, sort of thing. And you had like nationalistic music. You had people going and voting at referendums and showing, their showing that they did and they went and voted and how awesome it is, and all that stuff. And so that's where this idea of the Mask of Freedom comes from. Essentially, a mask that does not allow you to see or speak, but just by having these kind of very superficial wings that do not function, do not perform flight at all, but just the presence of these wings allow you to assume that you are now in this state of situation of freedom. One of the reasons, I guess, that led to the popularity of this image was that on the day I was out putting them up around town with the help of a couple of friends, some honorable citizens stopped us on the street. They did not appreciate the image, and it resulted in a little bit of a confrontation, which grabbed the attention of the Egyptian police, which got the attention of the Egyptian military police at the time. It was right after the revolution, so it was like a state of emergency. It was martial law, and the normal police laws did not function as they would. They were kind of overseen by the military and the military police. And basically this led to my detention as well as the detention of friends. Being a young, savvy sort of millennial, I guess, the first thing that came to mind was to tweet about it. And so I tweeted that I was getting arrested, and very, very quickly, Egyptian social media, all of a sudden, everyone was changing their profile pictures to the image of the to the image of the sticker, and it was spreading like super fast, really literally within minutes. And that was kind of the vibe at the time. Really, the kind of it felt like every Egyptian was an activist at that point in time, almost. We had just gone through this revolution, so everyone was with it, I guess. And so the activist community was quite strong at the time, and very quick to react. So you have like Egyptian Twitter kind of changing, or social media in general changing their all their avatars. I was still in a police vehicle Like I hadn't even made it to a station yet. They were waiting for orders from like the military guys on the radio. So they were just like cruising, like driving around town in this police vehicle waiting for orders for like a couple of hours. So this was all happening in the meantime. And then it ended up even on television. In the meantime, there was like some kind of political talk show of some kind. And they were talking, you know, having some kind of panel discussion of some kind, and word got out about a couple of kids getting arrested over their sticker. They showed the sticker on television. I don't know why they decided to stretch the image of the sticker on television, but they stretched the image of the sticker on television. Anyway, long story short, basically this kind of very sudden upheaval led to our being released. You know, basically we were taken to a station for questioning, and there was a protest waiting for us there. You know, people got word, they organized really quickly. They went and staged a protest there at the station, you know, certain people were making phone calls like, why were these kids getting arrested and so on. So it was becoming too much of a big deal too fast, and so they decided to like just let us go free of charge and all that. The second day, there was a big sit-in planned for the square. And I would say this might be the first sit-in that was actively an anti-military kind of sit-in. And, you know, I went to the square the second day at Tahrir Square, and there were t-shirts. You know, people had t-shirts, like almost like really literally within 24 hours, there were people wearing various, you could see very different styles of t-shirts even. And then I also appeared even on CNN. You see a young, naive Pwnkas troublemaker there. That's a young Genzir. I had no idea what I was doing at the time. And I even saw people with posters printed out. I mean, this dude, I remember, I didn't take this picture. This is someone else took this picture. But I remember this dude, I encountered him. And I was, you know, so he saw me kind of just looking at him, and he said, "Hey, do you know what this is about?" I'm like, "No, tell me, what is this about?" And he said, "Well, yesterday there was some dude putting up these stickers around town, and, you know, he got arrested for it." I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah." And then he told me, like, you know, he didn't have any problems with the military before hearing about this incident, and then when he heard that this dude got arrested for just expressing his opinion, he decided to go down to the square, you know. You know, so far we've looked at, you know, I guess some stickers, some murals, pamphlets, other types of art. I was really concerned, I think, with finding different ways to tackle the issues at hand, because you want to, you know, I guess you don't want to do the same thing twice. You want to have experiment with different tools in media and the effects each one will have, really. And so later, this was much later, this was a couple of years later, I did this collaboration with my friend who is a technologist, Yasmina Layot. She lives in New York now, and she's an Emmy award-winning filmmaker and technologist. She's super awesome. So we did this kind of interactive installation where you had basically an image projected onto this glass from inside this shop. It was an abandoned shop, was not used, and we got basically permission from the owners, the company that owned it, to make use of it for this, I guess you could say, some kind of impromptu art installation. And Yasmin took care of all the tech stuff, you know, which was basically having an infrared sensor and for the right programming and all that stuff to make the eyes of the character follow people down the street. So here you have literally a kind of like a police watchdog, I guess, right? In kind of uniform and everything. but this wasn't the only projected image. The project, what we did was we had it up for a whole month, 30 days. And the idea was that each day a new face would appear, a different face, and each face had kind of a different significance. It kept it interesting and had more meaning. This, for example, is the image of Khaled Said. Khaled Said was a character who was murdered by police before the Egyptian Revolution broke out in Alexandria, and he's kind of seen as an impetus kind of for the revolution breaking out. It's a striking kind of case of police violence. You could say somewhat like what happened with Eric Garner or George Floyd here in the United States. The murder of a person at the hands of police brutality, leading to people taking to the streets and protesting. In this case of Egypt, it led to all-out revolution and unseating the president. So the idea of having Khaled Said a couple of years later, after the a couple of years later, you could say it's a situation where people got a little bit sick of the protests, a bit sick of the revolution. This was what was it, 2013, I think? Yeah, and kind of had started to give up a little bit, which is what was leading to kind of you could say what would end up happening politically, and essentially the military kind of really managing to take hold. Although at the time it was, I think it was the Muslim Brotherhood was elected into office, so it was prior to the military coup and removing them from power. So at that time, the idea is like, I guess I'd say kind of looking at people, staring at them, and for them to assess if that's what they really wanted. That kind of result is what they wanted with the Brotherhood in power. This is Blue Bra, a woman that I spoke of earlier, and so on. So anyway, you could move on a little bit. Beyond the Egyptian Revolution, I get invited often to have exhibitions in other countries and other contexts, and I'm not really interested in sort of just taking something I did somewhere and showing it in this other context as a kind of exotic thing. I tend to look at the situation I'm in and try and create something that is context specific, place and time specific, and so on. So I was invited to Switzerland to partake in this, what was called Theater Festival Basel. And I had to do something, I want to do something for that context. And I don't really know a lot about Switzerland. What do we know about Switzerland? I guess great chocolate or whatever. All right. Good watches, maybe. So anyway, I did some research and I found this quote from the State Secretary of Economic Affairs of Switzerland, who said, "We exercise restraint for exports of war material to countries in North Africa and the Middle East, notably Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Egypt." And this stood out to me for a few reasons. One is that I didn't know that Switzerland was known for the export of war material in the first place, and so basically I did some research and I looked at okay, so who are the biggest importers of arms from Switzerland, and I discovered that the biggest importer was the United States of America. And one of their biggest imports in terms of arms is actually small arms, so handguns. And then I looked at the number of deaths in the United States for the annual deaths by gunshot in the United States, and I compared it to the number of deaths over the course of the entire Egyptian Revolution, and I found that the numbers were quite staggering. yellow here represents the number of deaths by gunshot in the United States, and the white represents the number of deaths since the Egyptian Revolution broke out to the time this piece was done, which was in 2012. So a year had passed essentially. And then, the Swiss, they're known for their affinity for voting. So I asked, should Switzerland ban arms exports to the United States? And then people were allowed to mark. And so you see here the number of yeses and the number of no's. It's not like this would change anything. Obviously, Switzerland still continues to export arms to the United States, but it's an interesting way to get people, I guess, to think about it. Also, to think about what makes a "quote unquote" conflict zone, right? Like if you are banning exports to these places because they are considered conflict zones, well, if you look at the number of deaths, and the number of deaths there are a lot less than other places, shouldn't these other places be considered possible conflict zones? In continuing the theme of guns, of course, I guess, this one was one I did in Germany. This was done in Frankfurt. And Frankfurt is kind of considered the banking capital of not just Germany, but of Europe in general. And so I wanted to do something with money, with euro bills, fake ones, obviously. And so I did this one on basically, a lot of the weapons that are used in conflicts in Africa are, all of them, aren't actually manufactured in Africa, right? So they come from China, from Russia, as well as from Europe. And of course, certain people profiteer from these conflicts. And so having the gun made out of euro bills, and also actually the belt, which would have been otherwise an ammo belt, is made out of like euro coins, but these are actually real coins. This one was the very last piece of street art I did in Egypt before having to leave. You could see I'm totally riffing off Mike Mignola in this one. Pretty much stole this design of with the skulls, but basically replaced Hellboy with an Egyptian soldier. This was after the military had kind of staged a coup. They removed the Morsi, who was the Muslim Brotherhood candidate for president, from office. They moved him from office. He was the elected president. They moved him from office. And then when his supporters took to a public square to protest that removal, they occupied a square for a couple of months, and then the Egyptian military essentially moved in, and there was, resulted in a big massacre of these protesters, which was unfortunately very much supported and hailed by other Egyptians. So you had this situation that was just kind of really messed up. So this was kind of my critique of that at the time, and that basically kind of, I guess you could say, the cherry on top that led to my sudden departure from Egypt. I had to leave, under unideal circumstances, and then I landed in America. And so in America, ladies and gentlemen, I very, very soon after I made it to the States, I had an exhibition called All American, and I started to talk about some of the issues in the United States that stood out to me at the time. This one is called The Great American Mask of Freedom. And so it's kind of an American version of the Mask of Freedom that I did in Egypt. And you could see, obviously, also I'm riffing off of Captain America here in this one. again, commentary on kind of the gun situation in the United States with this piece. I'm just going to go through these very quickly so I could get to the good comic stuff. But this one is kind of comic bookish. So basically, these are like 4 pieces on canvas that basically read like a comic, like a short strip. And it's called, I think it was called 4 Presidents Talking While Smoking or something. And basically it shows actual quotes from different presidents, but out of context. And it makes it look like it's a conversation they're having. So it starts with President Obama saying, "When I was a kid, I inhaled frequently. That was the point." Bush responds, he says, "Shh, you don't want some little kid doing what you tried, man." And then Bill Clinton, he takes the joint. He's like, "Yeah, here's what you say. I experimented with marijuana a time or 2, but I didn't inhale." And then Nixon responds, "Listen, fellas, when the president does it, it is not illegal." That was a piece. We have to, let's just go over that stuff. And basically, after that exhibition in particular was when I started to devise the work on the solar grid. The solar grid, you could say, is born out of basically all of that, in the sense that I felt like I was doing, with not comics art, other types of art. Each piece becomes about, I suppose, tackles a particular issue, right? Or you have a piece maybe that talks about militarism, or a piece that talks about totalitarian or authoritarianism or something, a piece that talks about perhaps sexism or something, and so on and so forth. And so I was also doing stuff about consumerism and so on. So after a while, it seemed that after doing all these different types of works, I had a little bit of an eureka moment where it felt like, oh, it's all connected. Like the environment, all of the harm we cause the environment is very closely connected to capitalism and industrialism. And that stuff is connected to colonialism, which is connected to totalitarianism, and so on, and also race relations as well. It seemed like so all connected, and I wanted to do something that basically was a work about all of those things, that connection, right? And it seemed that, well, I can't really do that in terms of like a painting or a piece of street art or something. It needed to be a comic book, a big graphic novel, essentially, that would talk about all this stuff. So I came up with the Solar Grid, which is basically the story of the world after reeling from a big environmental catastrophe, namely a global flood, which prompts people to, which prompts kind of an acceleration in technologies that are particularly service the exodus to Mars and relocating to Mars for habitation. We're talking like hundreds. This is a story that spans hundreds of years, and they people do leave Earth, they leave the planet, but of course it's a situation where, if you imagine it, of course not everyone gets to pick up and leave. Certain people do, certain people do not, and that in and of itself would raise questions of nationality and sex and race and class and so on, right? And so people do leave. Most people get left behind, in fact, because most people, do not fall into the most preferred categories, I suppose you could say. And they leave, but not before turning the Earth into a solar-powered factory by way of what they call the solar grid. The solar grid, which is basically this network, this big network of massive satellites that orbit the planet and act as artificial suns, essentially, absorbing sun rays and then beaming them down onto Earth. There are enough of these satellites that cover the entire Earth. So night is eliminated from Earth entirely. And this is to power these solar powered factories that are on Earth that run 24/7. They never stop. They're solar powered, and the satellites are up there all 24/7. And so they never stop, and they produce goods that are primarily for export to Mars. And Mars sends the waste back to Earth. So Earth becomes the kind of de facto factory, as well as kind of junkyard, I suppose, for Mars. And our story kind of follows these two orphans, Mehet and Kamin, who on Earth, they rummage through the waste on Earth. They go through stuff, try to find valuable items they could sell or live off, and they come upon an item that basically gets them entangled in a plot of some kind, or that's not a plot. Let's just say it gets them involved into. It leads to a chain reaction of that is eventually results in the destruction of the solar grid. Now that's kind of as straightforward a pitch I could deliver, but it's actually not so straightforward, because the story does kind of take place over hundreds of years. It kind of tackles like how the solar grid came to be and the different efforts to resist the solar grid along the way, all of which fail, but it culminates in this final effort that succeeds, right? And so in kind of dealing with this big narrative, I had to try and come up with creative solutions to distinguish between the different timelines. So, you know, here are a few. So these are actually all of the dates. We have 1818 AD, 2019 AD. These are the dates that I kind of focus on in this particular narrative. And then 9 after the flood, AF is after the flood, which is, you know, the big major event. And then the dating system changes. You have 378 after the flood, 474 after the flood, and then finally 949 after the flood. 949 is basically the main timeline with these two kids in it. And then all of this is what precedes them. So for example, for 2019 AD, I have a sequence that takes place in Tokyo, Japan. And for that, you know, I wanted to like riff off of manga, but not in a superficial sense. You know, you get like a lot of times you find these books that are like how to draw manga, and then they have like these kind of, okay, this face is triangular, and then you make these big eyes, and it's kind of a very superficial way of looking at manga. I didn't necessarily want to draw like a manga artist superficially, that style. I wanted to kind of riff off of the storytelling techniques, actually, more so. And so, you know, you find that the storytelling, the cut from panel to panel is basically the flow of the narrative is very much taken from manga. The animated faces, in fact, the faces are animated, the kind of body language that you can see in manga sometimes, really big sound effects. Even for kind of things that maybe don't sound so loud, things like that, you know. So I riff off manga for this one. In 9 after the flood, this sequence takes place actually in a flooded Cairo. So it's only 9 years since the flood. They haven't had a chance to construct the solar grid, which would lead to the evaporation of a lot of the water, you know, on the Earth, kind of most of that water becoming humidity and clouds in the sky. But prior to constructing the solar grid, the world was flooded. And so to kind of depict this very flooded world, I figured, you know, do a lot of ink wash and get a sense of everything being very wet and moisty and kind of moldy, you know, eliminating kind of I guess gutters for the exterior sequences, and then having them kind of padded out with these whites in the interior sequences. For 378 after the flood, so for this one, this is actually depicted as a flashback sequence. So I wanted some kind of very whimsical line art. So you see all the lines are just kind of done not as tight as in other sequences. There's still kind of an ink wash, but it's different. You know, it's handled through this kind of Zipatone look, but it's still kind of somewhat ink washy, a little less though, because at this point in time, the solar grid has been constructed. And you get these whimsical lines, no panel borders at all. The panels just flow into each other because it's all like a memory flashback sequence kind of thing. All the whimsical lines are done with the same kind of very thick brush. And then 474 after the flood, things are a bit cleaner at this point in time. This is kind of the look of that period. 949 after the flood, which is kind of the main timeline, you get this kind of stark black and white approach. The earth is very dry. It's all a kind of a junkyard essentially, and there's lots of debris everywhere. The remains of a civilization in a sense, because all that junk would be the junk from Earth's past, as well as the things that are sent from Mars, not only the new Mars stuff, right? So the entirety of human history almost is just there in the junk piles. But when the solar grid is activated, then the line art changes. We don't get any big black shadows. So it's all like very hyper exposed kind of hyper exposed world. So you get these super thin lines here to kind of evoke that sense, and no shadows at all. That's for Earth. So all of Earth is black and white. Once I do have like off-planet sequences, which I do, and all of them take place in the 949 after the flood, like this timeline here. So some sequences take place on like the moon, some sequences take place on Mars, and so I needed to differentiate as well. So for the moon, I came up with this essentially 4-panel grid look that is applied throughout all of the moon sequences, and I gave it like kind of this color that's sort of all periwinkle-ish color, which gives it, I feel, evokes a sense of a kind of lunar glow, I guess. You know, that's the look of these sequences. Mars, on the other hand, is another story. So Mars, we get kind of full color in a sense, but like weird full color, you know, because for Mars, for people to be able to cope with life on Mars, there is basically a system and a big virtual reality and augmented reality kind of system in place that allows people having all that augmented reality in their world, that makes the world look nicer than it actually is, and the cities look nicer than it actually is, makes them able to cope with life on Mars. So, you know, you have like fake shrubbery and fake bushes and stuff that aren't actually there in this world. And you can't really differentiate what's real, what isn't real. And to make it look like almost not so real, I gave it this kind of color treatment. And also they're all kind of connected in their heads to this system called Hively, which is sort of, think of it as the internet, but like it's in your head. And so what you see in the background here, all of the events that are taking place in the background, that's all that communication, that network between people and media and so on, just crowding, you know, just there in the backdrop the entire time, in people's heads the entire time. And that's kind of the look for that. Also, you'll notice that all the panels on Mars are square. They're different sizes, but they're all square. Again, this idea of like almost pre-packaging reality and delivering it in a parcel or something, I guess what it evokes. For the moon, by the way, the reason also I came up with a strict 4-panel grid is I figure time on the moon moves a lot slower, is quite still, right? Because the moon doesn't quite revolve around its axis the way Earth or Mars does. And so the passage of time would feel weird. It would feel very monotonous in a way, was the idea. So that's kind of pretty much it. That's the solar grid. A lot of the question, of course, I get, a lot of time is, where do I read it? Because of course I've been working on it for 5 years and it is not available in comic book shops, or you don't find it listed in Diamond or any of that stuff. So there are 3 ways for people to read the Solar Grid if they would like. Option A is the solargrid.net, where you could download high-res PDFs and CB, the other comic book format, whatever it is. Yeah, you could even they're high enough resolution to, if you feel like printing out your own bootleg copies, if you so please. The other option is, right now you could go to Kickstarter and search for Radix Media, which is a printer publisher in New York and independently owned and operated. And they're running a Kickstarter for a graphic narrative series that includes multiple books. One of them is a serialized edition of the Solar Grid. I believe there are like 5 days left on that campaign. So if you want to get a printed edition, a really nicely printed edition, because they make everything, in their facilities by hand, you could check that out. And the final option would be Mythomatic.com. You could go sign up for the newsletter, and essentially, when I'm completely finished with the entirety of the Solar Grid, I'll be collecting it in one hardback book, and it will be available on Mythomatic.com, which you'll be notified of if you sign up for the newsletter there. And that's pretty much it. I guess I'm ready for a Q&A now.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin McGurk. I'm one of the curators at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, and I'm going to be moderating the Q&A. Thank you, Gonzier, so much for this presentation. This was fantastic, and it's so nice to see such beautiful art on what is a very gloomy day here in Columbus, Ohio. This was excellent, and we have a lot of questions. I'm going to try, hopefully we'll get through as many of them as possible. So let's get started. You had said that you were just a punk-ass kid. To go from making a zine to a global movement face spokesperson, how did you mentally make that transition? Did you have a mentor or someone that helped you to navigate this new influence or spotlight?
No. The short answer is no. And to be honest, I never really cared much for what it means to be in a spotlight or something, because it's not like, at the end of the day, you're not, being in the spotlight was a bit problematic initially, because I remember there was a point in time, I'm supposed to be like operating insidiously, right, in the context of Cairo and all that stuff. And I remember there was a point where I went to the bank, and then the bank teller said, "Hey, are you Gonzier?" And so that was a bit weird and disconcerting. And of course, it makes sense why I would end up becoming noticeable enough to end up having to leave a country that is operated by an authoritarian regime, right? So I guess being in the spotlight is not necessarily something I seek out or whatever. It's just the important thing is to do the work, right? Do the work and do it well, and hopefully just make good stuff. I don't know.
Well, that actually transitions great into another question from the audience, which is, what is your advice for young Egyptian artists and activists who want to express themselves in the increasingly fascist climate in Egypt and worldwide?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not sure you should get advice from someone who got into as much trouble as I did. Obviously, I might give you some ill-informed advice, but I would say, being as smart as possible. I don't think you should. I think here's the thing. I think a lot of people opt to take a certain position that they think they believe in. That position might be like these military guys, they know what they're doing, they're good, it's fine, take that position because of the reality of the situation. And even if you don't really believe it, you're just doing that because it's a safe thing to do. The safe thing to do might be not to publicly speak out. That's the safe thing to do. The safe thing to do is not to actually convince yourself that these are good people or this is a good situation. That in actuality is a very dangerous position to be in, because it would lead to the prolonging of a terrible totalitarian rule that will impact not only you, but also your children and your grandchildren, possibly for a very long time. So I would say the right thing to do is probably to acknowledge that, okay, I can't do this publicly, but these people need to be overcome in some way. And I think I think it's important for there to be an alternative narrative to what is popular, that is being projected in media and a newspaper that is largely controlled by the state, or even if it's privately owned by private individuals and private businesses, they have a stake in, being in bed with the state, and they probably don't want to contradict it too much. Or if it's not the state, then it's a particular political party, and they're going to show preference to that party. And it's important to have like an alternative narrative. Do it smartly. Try and do it like covertly as possible. That's what I would say.
Okay. Do you feel like Egypt's art scene was positively or negatively impacted by the revolution and the fallout?
I would say initially it was very positively impacted, because there was an explosion of very incredibly creative, unofficial kind of artistic output that came out in the aftermath of the revolution. There was street puppetry, people doing like puppetry things on the streets that were amazing. Street theater. A lot of fantastic music that came out. So like if almost there was like a break between before and after. Before, all of the songs and music was just crappy pop music about dating and falling in love and that sort of thing. Right after, then you have this explosion of like political, amazing, very strong, very powerful political music. With the street art as well, I would say the street art that came out in Egypt was not unlike any street art I've seen anywhere else in the world, and I've seen quite a lot, because it was very urgent, it was very creative, it had humor, it had like a million cultural references in it. It was really clever, powerful stuff. And it was a lot of it, like you would wake up any day and there would be just more of it everywhere. Also in publishing, there was quite a lot of amazing output. So I would say immediate, that's the period I'm aware of, because that's when I was there. I've not been back in Egypt since 2014. So quite a long time now, over 6 years, or about 6 years. And so I don't know what it's like since I think it's safe to assume that it's taken a dive, that because of the grip of the state now. Having said that, I've also read a lot about how in a lot of authoritarian countries, like what you see in books and art and stuff, there's a lot of creative output that comes as a result of that stuff being said between the lines, and more kind of sneaky kind of ways to resist. And maybe that's the case in Egypt, but as far as I know, I don't know how it's doing now, to be honest.
So there are quite a few questions that generally get at the bigger question of who are your influences, and were you particularly influenced by any Egyptian periodicals that included comics and cartoon art, or just Egyptian cartoonists in general?
So talking about influences, like I didn't get to actively follow like influences by name until quite later in life, late in age. I was well into like beyond my mid-20s or something when I started to notice the names behind certain artists. Growing up, however, I got my comics from essentially a flea market in Cairo called Sur Esbekeya, where they sell a lot of used publications, not just comics, magazines, books, novels, everything. A lot of it is from Egypt, but also a lot of it is, from outside of Egypt. Oftentimes, if someone wants to get rid of their books, they just sell it to like a used bookseller who will buy it by the weight essentially, and then you get it for very cheap from this market. So I would go and there would be like random American comics there, like just piles on a sidewalk, in some dude's little shop, and magazines and stuff as well. So from Egypt, I was definitely like influenced by a lot of stuff that I can't name. I never paid attention to who the name of the artist was behind a lot of these older publications that I got. But I picked up a lot of old publications that date back to the 20s and 30s from Egypt. I loved a lot of the cover art for a lot of the pulp novels. So you find, like, if you find old Naguib Mahfouz novels, for example, they have these really great pulpy covers. I don't think the artist is credited most of the time in a lot of these. Those were pretty awesome, as well as like America, a lot of American kind of old pulp and science fiction novels and stuff. And for definitely, like, comics have always been like a huge influence. When I started to become more aware, Mike Mignola was of course a big one, because I love his minimalism. His storytelling is really great. It's unusual compared to a lot of others. Eddie Campbell, I quite love certain works of his, kind of the scratchy inkiness of it, and kind of the you don't get a masking of the process that you get with a lot of the commercial corporate comics, the Marvel DC stuff. You can't see the process because it's masked by all the coloring and all the digital this and that. And then with something like Eddie Campbell, you really get to really see the line art and how it came to be almost. Quite early heavy metal stuff for sure, which was translated from Metal Hurlant. I used to be into, I think I'm still into Sergio Topi a lot. And, that's to name a few. I did a trip to Japan recently. I picked up a bunch of manga that's all in Japanese. I have no idea what the names of the artists are. I can't read them, but they look fantastic. So I pick up like a million influences also from art, like I like to visit galleries and museums a lot. And, I wish I paid more attention to all the names. Design is a big thing. I follow graphic design. So I'm kind of a sponge. I like soak up whatever I can get.
Yeah, actually, a question had come through just now about related to museums. Someone said, I was surprised to know from your website that your works have been collected by institutions from all over the world, but not by any in Egypt. Can you share your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, what Egyptian institution in their right minds would want to collect any of my work? My work obviously is very much oppositional to the status quo in Egypt, to the state, and all of the institutions are, the major institutions I imagine are all like either state owned or state affiliated in some way. I do have like private collectors in Egypt, but I don't go and name all of my private collectors on my website. I only name the institutions, but private collectors, there are a few private collectors in Egypt for sure.
So someone asks, I want to ask about censorship. Did the Egyptian government try to ban these drawings? And to kind of tag on to that, another question, throughout the process of making your street art, were you concerned for your own safety and being arrested?
So the first half of the question is whether the state tried to ban it. I mean, all of the street art is now, it's my understanding that most of it has been kind of eliminated, like painted over. So I think since the rise of Sisi in 2013 or whatever, 14, since he came to power, essentially there's been like a strong effort to remove all of the street art. We're talking about the street art drawings in particular. In terms of the other half of the question, which was being concerned for my own safety, probably not enough, right? I mean, I guess if I was more concerned, I probably wouldn't have done a lot of what I did and wouldn't be where I am now here. So I guess not enough, but sure, there was a degree of concern. At the time, though, I guess to understand the mindset, you have to understand that sort of. So before the breakout of the Egyptian Revolution, I was doing a lot of commercial art, not exclusively. I also did a bunch of like gallery art and exhibitions and that sort of thing. But the vast majority of my bread and butter was commercial art, which entailed doing kind of a lot of branding and design work for, medium-sized businesses, whether it's like a store, some kind of hip modern furniture store, or some kind of cafe or something where upper middle class folks would typically hang out. And so when you do that sort of work, at least for me, you have to talk yourself into thinking that it's important work. Otherwise, I won't be able to get up in the morning and do it. So I'm in the mindset of like, oh, this is good for improving kind of like, I don't know, design taste or whatever your motive is. Like there's some kind of thing where you're telling yourself this is important. And then when the Egyptian Revolution broke out, all of a sudden you're like, actually, like all of that is not important. It's in fact part of the problem, because it has to do with the kind of economic situation, that's a big part of the reasons for revolt. And so in realizing at the time that it was not important, then I came to the conclusion that maybe it's actually never important at all, and we just talk ourselves into thinking it's important because it's an opportunity, it's a job we get paid, and so on, and you just kind of go with the flow. And so, my main concern has always been like to do important work, and I realized like that just was not important, and now this thing is of utmost importance, and especially when armed with the conviction that that our actions are in fact what would tip the situation in whose favor, in a way. Where would the situation go depended entirely on people's actions, right? If people had not taken to the square, had not staged essentially a mass strike on a national level across the entire country for those 2 weeks, Mubarak would not have fallen, So you realize that actually our actions do influence things and tip things over, and I was kind of really, that was the drive and the fuel and the concern, more so than trying to be super safe. Obviously, you need to balance things out. You need to be somewhat a little, don't be stupid, but also, I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does, yeah. And it actually kind of leads into another question that came in. If you'd be in Cairo right now, if you're in Cairo right now, would you still be producing very direct posters and stickers criticizing the government, or would you somehow maneuver your way through and not be as direct about these political issues?
I would maneuver my way through. Maybe I would do a graphic novel. Maybe it wouldn't necessarily be the Solar Grid. Maybe it might be something else. Although the Solar Grid does tackle things in very indirect ways, but still, I think regardless of the of whether in the States or in Egypt, I probably would be doing a graphic novel. It's possible the subject matter might be different a little bit, but a graphic novel is probably a good way to deal with things in a less direct way through the mask of fiction, so to speak.
Speaking of the Solar Grid, so are you using traditional artistic methods when making your comics, or is it done completely traditional or completely digitally?
It is done, all the drawing is done completely traditionally. So old school pen, paper, and ink, which is really nice when you see like the stack kind of growing like that. It's getting to be an excessively large stack right now. But the coloring is done digital. For those sequences that are in color, those are done digital.
Well, us librarians love hearing that. I think that's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear you're doing work on paper still. And not that there's anything wrong with digital art. Actually, another library type question. Someone is asking, where can we find the zine that you showed early on? That was a tutorial about managing your, keeping yourself safe during a riot. And are you archiving your work?
The Arabic language zine, I don't think is around. It might be floating around somewhere. I don't have it anymore. I lost a lot of work in like my multiple moves and lost a bunch of hard drives along the way and stuff. So actually, like, there is a lot of work on my website, but also I probably lost more than I have. Let me see. Actually, I don't even know. I'm gonna look up my publication, see if I have that linked as a download or not. Really quickly. Okay, let's see. It looks like I do not have the full zine of that. I just have a bunch of pictures I took of some of the pages folded out. So you could get those for the Arabic version. If you want the English translation, I think the Atlantic has. You could go to the Atlantic, just search Google for Egypt Revolution pamphlet or something. My name isn't associated with it because I never got like put credit on the manual or anything. But you'll find they have translated an excerpt, I guess, if that helps.
Okay, great. Speaking of your name, someone was wondering, where did the name Ganzir come from? Ganzir.
So Ganzir is Egyptian Arabic for bicycle chain. The chain, not the chain you use to lock a bicycle, the chain that connects the pedals to the wheels, basically. And the idea behind Ganzir, for me, it felt like a good metaphor for the role of artist and designer and author even in society, in that perhaps maybe we are not the sources of creation as much as some may like to think, as much as we like just to connect ideas, essentially, right? But that connection of different ideas that may seem divorced is what allows kind of the machine of society, so to speak, to be pedaled and move forward, is the idea. So a simple connection.
Yeah. So I think we have time for just a few more. And there are many, many more. Are you intentionally critiquing Elon Musk's ideas in Solar Grid?
Yes, amongst others, but sure. Elon Musk is up there. But he's a very problematic figure in my view.
Let's see. Oh, there was a good one that I've just lost track of in here. So many questions keep coming in. What made you choose to come to America after you learned about some of the issues going on here? This person says, I'm referencing the gun violence art that you created.
Yeah, so the situation with the States, landing in the States was I had never been actually to the States. I did have a visa. So, people who have passports that are not US or British or European passports may not fully understand this way it works. So some people think if you have a passport, you just can go anywhere in the world, regardless of where that passport was issued. It's not like that. As an Egyptian, when you have a passport, actually the number of countries you can go to without a visa are extremely limited. And so first you have to apply for a visa, which is this long process. And it's sort of the way for countries to kind of filter who they can allow inside and who they cannot. So I, having had exhibitions and stuff in Europe, had been there quite a bunch, but my European visas were already expired. The only visa I had that I hadn't used was a US visa. And so it was just like a matter of, okay, I'm in trouble now, I need to get out of here. And so just flipping through my passport, seeing where I can go, and I just had a valid US visa. And so I boarded a flight to America. And that was pretty much the entirety of my decision making.
Well, and I have to ask, and now Texas. How did you end up in Texas?
Yeah, that's another like funny kind of like bunch of circumstances. But so yeah, it's basically it's a kind of boring answer. My wife, she just got a job here in Texas at the Rice University, and she also is not from Texas. You know, she's from California, and she had never been to Texas before, and she got this good job. She's an academic, and you know, so we came down to Texas and Houston. You know, and actually, it's pretty awesome city. It's great.
How has living in America impacted your most recent art and the themes you explore in it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the art, you know, I think, you know, there are some pieces I showed, I guess, from that exhibition, but aside from that, I think being here is largely what led to the solar grid, in that I wanted to do something, again, that talked about basically the relationship between capitalism, imperialism, the effect on the environment, how that also connects to racism and sexism and so on. So it really, being here, I guess, helped see all of those connections very clearly, because all of those things are very evident here. You know, it's a little astonishing that not enough people, I think, see all of these connections, despite that prominence, and despite lots of you know, especially within academia, lots of research and writings and things on that matter. But yeah, I think that's the biggest impact, is just the connection between all these things.
Great. And so I'm going to bring Magda back on to wrap things up for us, since we're just about out of time. But I'm sure for those who couldn't get their questions answered here, they can find you on social media. You're on Twitter and Instagram, just at Ganzier, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And your website is ganzier.com. So hopefully folks can go over there and find some of the information they were looking for. So I'll turn it
Awesome.
over to you now, Magda.
Okay, it looks to me like my camera is not working again, and I would like to thank you, Ganzier, for a brilliant presentation on behalf of Ohio State University Library. Thank you to all the guests from around the world for attending this event. A big thank you to everyone who worked so hard to make this webinar a great success, and to our institutional sponsors. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for future viewing. So we will be sending you all the link shortly. Before I go, I just have a quick reminder that the next webinar in our series, titled The Four Immigrant, will take place on November 4th from 6 to 7:30 Eastern Time. Well, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.